With the trade and cooperation agreement basically fully implemented, the Conservatives out of office, and Labour promising friendlier relations with the EU, it feels like the UK can finally turn the page on what's been a thoroughly chaotic 8 years since that fateful referendum. So, unfortunately for anyone that's tired of Brexit, and that's basically everyone, it looks like it might be returning to the political front lines via the eternally thorny issue of Gibraltar. Now, the UK and Spain have been trying to sort out a bespoke deal for the British Overseas Territory since, well, really 2016. But despite some positive sounds last year, it looks like negotiations have faltered. And on Wednesday, The Telegraph reported that Spanish authorities are about to impose a hard border. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Gibraltar's ongoing Brexit woes, why they're getting worse, and how Starmer might respond. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So to understand this story, we need a bit of context. Constitutionally, Gibraltar is a British overseas territory, much like Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, and the Falklands. Brexit has been a particularly thorny issue for Gibraltar though, because, unlike the other British overseas territories, Gibraltar obviously shares a land border with the EU via Spain. This is why when the UK joined the European Community, the forerunner to the European Union in 1972, unlike other overseas territories, Gibraltar joined the EU as well as a so-called special territory. Until Brexit, this arrangement actually worked remarkably well. Brits residing in Gibraltar could easily move across the border into Spain to work, shop and relax, and vice versa. Roughly 15,000 people, about half of the territory's working population, cross the border every day. The vote to leave the European Union, however, threatened to upend this, despite the fact that 96% of Gibraltar residents voted against leaving the EU on an 84% turnout. Specifically, it threatened to end free movement, which would have crippled Gibraltar's economy. Without a deal, Gibraltar would have essentially left the EU to a hard Brexit position, with the border becoming part of the EU's external border. Now, because of Gibraltar's special status, it wasn't included in the main Brexit deal. This meant that both sides scrambled to try and get an agreement in place before the Brexit transition period, which did cover Gibraltar, ended on the 31st of December 2020. Eventually, just hours before the end of the transition period, the UK and Spain reached an agreement in principle, which avoided a hard border by bringing Gibraltar into the Schengen area. That's the area on mainland Europe where internal border controls have been abolished, and anyone can travel freely from one nation to another with minimal, if any, checks. By joining Schengen, residents of Gibraltar could travel freely into Spain and vice versa, though British citizens arriving from the UK would be subject to passport controls. In order to make this happen, Spain, a signatory to the Schengen Agreement, would act as a guarantor or sponsor of Gibraltar. This was optimal for both British residents in Gibraltar, who could enter and leave Spain without having their passport stamped or using up their 90-day visa-free travel limit, and for Spanish workers, who could continue commuting into Gibraltar. Now, certain arch-Brexiteers were never entirely comfortable with this, because they didn't like the idea of a British territory getting closer to the EU by de facto joining the Schengen area when they thought the UK was supposed to be moving away from the EU. But they let it slide because, well, the alternative was chaos. At the time, Spain's foreign minister estimated it would take around 6 months to transform that agreement in principle into an actual treaty and get it signed by both sides. But over 3 years later, both sides are still negotiating. This lack of agreement has already begun to have substantive negative impacts on the residents of Gibraltar. Following the UK and Gibraltar's departure from the EU, reciprocal healthcare agreements came to an end. Agreements which previously meant British citizens from Gibraltar had the same rights to healthcare in the EU as EU citizens. Now, Spain temporarily extended these agreements until June 2022, but when no deal materialised, the deal lapsed. Gibraltar's government then had to warn its residents to make sure they took out travel insurance with medical cover every time they crossed the border, including just going on a shopping trip or even just a meal. In April, former Foreign Secretary David Cameron claimed that the two sides were, quote, very close to a deal, a sentiment echoed by Gibraltar's chief minister, who told reporters, "We are very, very, very close." In English, we say within a spitting distance, but it's actually nice to say we are within kissing distance. Unfortunately, this deal fell through after the right-wing press and arch-Brexiteers within the Conservative Party complained that the deal would undermine British sovereignty. This was apparently because, to keep the border open, the EU and UK decided to basically shift the de facto border to Gibraltar's airport, in much the same way that in order to keep the Irish land border open, the two sides shifted the de facto border into the Irish Sea. Now, this would involve EU officials carrying out immigration controls at the airport, thereby allowing Gibraltar to join the passport-free Schengen zone, eliminating the need for controls at its border with Spain. Conservative MPs and the right-wing press, however, didn't like this for two reasons. Firstly, they just didn't like the idea of Gibraltar joining Schengen, even if it's the only way to keep Gibraltar's economy afloat, both because they thought it pushed Gibraltar too close to the EU, but also because the EU said that Gibraltar would have to follow certain single market rules, which would be enforced by European judges. There was also the accompanying worry that in the long term, regulatory alignment and judicial oversight by the EU and an open border might push Gibraltar away from the UK, and maybe even encourage a future Spanish administration to expand its long-standing territorial claim to the Rock, as suggested by the Spanish football team recently. For context, Spain currently only formally claims the disputed isthmus connecting Gibraltar to the mainland, but historically has claimed the entire peninsula. Secondly, Tory MPs didn't like the idea of EU officials performing checks at the airport because it doubles as the RAF station on Gibraltar, which makes it a particularly sensitive issue for the Brexiteer right. Anyway, there was some hope that with the Tory arch-Brexiteers now mostly out of Parliament, Labour will be able to press ahead with the deal, but apparently this hasn't happened. Nothing was agreed at the bilateral meeting between Starmer and Sanchez last week, so this week, Spanish authorities began building the infrastructure along the border for the EU's new automated entry and exit system for the Schengen zone, which requires biometric data for non-EU citizens and is due to come into force this November. This has sparked some alarm in Gibraltar, where residents aren't particularly keen on the border, let alone a relatively complicated one requiring biometric data. How Starmer reacts to this will be interesting. For obvious political reasons, he's basically avoided talking about Brexit at all, but if he agrees to the deal that's currently on the table, which seems like the sensible thing to do, it'll be perhaps the first concrete data point to suggest that in actual policy terms, this Labour government will be taking a softer line on Brexit than its predecessor. And if you want to learn more about Labour's Brexit policies, or their policies more general, then you should check out Too Long.
We've been working on this for a while now, but it's about to be printed and shipped. So here's everything you need to know. Too Long is 60 pages of our very best journalism, diving deeper into issues than we can on YouTube. As you can see from the front cover, this issue is focused on the UK general election, explaining what Labour want to do with their new huge majority, what each of the other parties are going to do next, and much more. It's more than just the UK though, with major stories from across Europe and the world, including the US election, the countries who could join the EU, the war in Gaza, and the European elections. We're really proud of how this product has turned out, and we think it's some of our best writing yet, able to dive into topics in a way that the algorithm just wouldn't allow. It's also a great way to support the channel, with the cost of production only increasing as we expand and advertising markets getting less stable. Your support helps us improve the business, improve our journalism, and helps us make more free YouTube content for everyone. If you're interested, you can go to toolong.news to buy a copy. You can also subscribe to Too Long, which gets you 25% off the price and a copy sent straight to you every 4 months. Subscribing really helps us turn this into a reliable revenue stream, which is super helpful when it comes to growing our business. Plus, if physical isn't your thing, then there's also digital versions. Anyway, sales close soon, so head to toolong.news to order now, and make sure to use code FINALORDERS to get an extra £2 off your purchase. Thanks for watching and for supporting TLDR.